What's up, everybody? Thanks for joining us. If you've ever seen a picture of Hanoi, there is a decent chance that the picture included the Long Biên Bridge, Ko Long Biên, as it has a kind of symbolic significance and historic importance that can only really be rivaled in the city by the likes of Hoan Kiem Lake. While the role of the bridge has remained relatively the same since it was built, crossing the river, its role in a social context has developed in a really interesting way throughout the last century and a half. So today we're going to be trying to understand how people feel about this iconic, rusty old bridge and why. So first, let's, as always, cover a little bit of context. In 1897, the French colonial government makes it official that they would begin contracting firms to build a bridge across the Red River, and by the next year, a Paris-based engineering firm is awarded the contract. And this is where we should highlight a very common misconception, common enough that it's found on tourism websites, and even AI chatbots can include it as a piece of trivia about the bridge. And that's on the involvement of one Gustave Eiffel and his company Eiffel et Cie. Pardon mon français. Anyway, he was not personally involved in the construction, though he was connected to some of the companies that we'll highlight here. The story of why he wasn't involved is an extremely interesting rabbit hole of its own, related to the disastrous attempt by the French Empire to build the Panama Canal, an effort that predated the Americans and led to tens of thousands of deaths. But that's too far afield to cover here, so back to the bridge. The main firm contracted for building the bridge was one Société de Construction de Levallois-Perret, what we'll be referring to throughout the rest of this video as just SCLP. This company was similar to a crown corporation in practice, basically being the construction arm of the state of France, but was actually privately owned by a consortium of wealthy French capitalists, because capitalism is when the state is just the top strata of rich guys, blah 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 blah. While some local artisans would work on the bridge and receive meager salaries or wages, the vast majority of the actual work that was done was supplied by something called corvée labor, which we've touched on in other videos, but is essentially when slave labor is used for a public works project, despite SCLP not being a publicly held entity. Because remember, if it doesn't come from the Corvier region of France, you've just got sparkling chattel slavery. The precise number of people who died during construction is unfortunately unknown and likely lost to history, but it sure as fuck wasn't zero. The complex steel lattice work that makes up the bridge was contracted out to a company called Rickety, and this is likely where the confusion around the involvement of Eiffel comes about, because Rickety used similar methods and techniques and worked extensively with Eiffel et Cie on other projects and shared technical knowledge. The bridge reached completion in 1902, meaning that the bridge started and finished construction in the same years as the years of rule of this guy, the Governor General of French Indochina based out of Hanoi. His name was Joseph Athanase Doumer, who apparently went by Paul because the bridge would go on to be given the name Pont Paul Doumer. Doumer would eventually go on to become the president of France in 1931 before getting murked a year later in 1932 by another guy named Paul Gorgulov, who was a veteran of the Imperial Russian White Army and was some kind of proto-eco-fascist, also an interesting and pretty crazy rabbit hole, but not for here. Now, some of our more astute viewers may have seen that amateurish little graphic and thought to yourselves, nah dog, that's not the French president hat. And you'd be right. There is no French president hat. This is the imperial crown of Napoleon Bonaparte, who came to power by ending the First French Republic, and this was done as a way for us to forcefully and not subtly in any way shoehorn in here that rights, read privileges, like the liberté, égalité, and fraternité, came and went within France at different periods of time, but that shit was never allowed for the colonies. And while imperialism has inevitably evolved into neo-imperialism, those outside of the core are never regarded as the same as those inside it. So with that, big shout out to the Alliance of Sahel States. Great ass. Or, wait, apparently it's AES, but still great. The name of the bridge would go on to be changed to Long Biên upon independence in 1954. Taking the name from an ancient city that's two-storied and likely apocryphal to cover here, but it's interesting to note that the name actually significantly predates Long Biên District, which was cut out of Zalam District years later, meaning that the modern district actually takes its name from the bridge and not the other way around. Considering the time period and the place, it was really an amazing feat of engineering. At just under 2.5 kilometers, it was one of the longest bridges in all of Asia at that point. And the Red River is seriously big, and it's located in a place that's prone to typhoons. Take a look at our videos on Typhoon Yagi for reference on just how much water we're talking about here. Another interesting point of consideration is that while there are now 6, soon to be 7 bridges across the river, there were none at that period of time. There were no surrounding high-rise developments. It would have drastically stood out and been legitimately intimidating to know that your oppressors are capable of creating something so grand, and knowing that it facilitated colonial troop movement throughout the region. It also finally established road and rail connection between Hanoi and the important harbor city of Haiphong, which acted as the shipping port that important industrial materials such as coal and rubber were extracted from for shipment back to France. By the time that the rather famous sequel to World War I ended, and what is called the First Indochina War broke out in 1946, the bridge was an obvious strategic target for the Viet Minh revolutionary forces to hamper the movement of colonial troops throughout the North. After gaining independence for the North, and the shift from dealing with baguette-based colonialism to hamburger colonialism, the bridge became a target for American bombing and was successfully struck in both 67 and 72. As the bridge had become just as important strategically for the PAVN, the People's Army of Vietnam, as it had been for the French for the 3/4 of a century prior. This also marked a really interesting shift in perceptions of the bridge, as it was no longer an intimidating symbol of imperial dominance, but the strategic value and communal impetus around repairing it after strikes led to it becoming a symbol of defiance, strength, and resolve. A less public-facing but extremely important reality to consider as well is that the bridge and the train tracks that run across it were the only line on which material aid, military supplies, fuel, food, and medicine could be received from the People's Republic of China, which was crucial to success. We'll link an excellent article in the description with more info on that. When considered in the current context, it's old, it's really rusty and haggard, and clearly in need of extensive, and what will no doubt be expensive repairs at the minimum. When I asked around about it, I expected a mixed response, but was quite surprised when everyone I brought up the idea of tearing it down and replacing it with a new one to met me quite literally unanimously with reactions of what can best be described as a kind of horror at the idea. It's been such an important point of reference for a century and a half. Generations have come and gone with it being a focal point of the city and life of the entire region, and as such, no one wants to see it go. Hopefully, when it inevitably does undergo repairs, it can manage to maintain its historic charm, and through that, its social connection. Anyway, that's all from us this week. Be sure to lick that like button, subscribe. We'll catch you on the next one. Later!